Titu Atura Renelta Arluk. Hello, my name is Renelta Arluk, Director of Indigenous Arts at Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. And I come to you from Treaty 7 territory here in Banff, Alberta, Canada. I just want to say thank you so much for everyone acknowledging the territories that they're joining us in from. We're home of the Stoney Nakoda, Sitana the Dene, Blackfoot Confederacy, and Métis Region 3, as well as gathering nations of Ktunaxa and Cree, as well as some Inuk. I'm originally from the Northwest Territories. My mother is Dene Suslene and Cree from Treaty 8 Territory in Wood Buffalo region. And my father's Anuvialuit Gwich'in from the Nunavut region. So I've been living here in Treaty 7 territory for the past 4 years with my family, my partner, and my young son, Carver, who's 5. And it's just been really incredible to be able to grow up to live within the mountains. Where I come from, it's Canadian Shield. It's barren land. And so it's quite a difference nature-wise, but each of them quite inspiring. Speaking of inspiration, I'm really grateful. This is probably our 5th Decolonizing the Narrative conversation sessions, and I'm pretty happy to be listening and talking with Paul Seesequasis today and tomorrow. If you haven't joined them, what we've been doing, the whole focus of Decolonizing the Narrative, is to have these conversations with Indigenous art leaders who are using different art disciplines in a way that, in centering Indigenous wisdom, thinking of how they approach their work from that lens, and it's been pretty incredible. Last month we had Ursula Johnson join us, and so yes, very excited to have Paul today. So Paul Seesequasis is a Willow Cree writer, cultural worker, curator, and commentator currently residing in Saskatchewan, Saskatoon. He curates the Indigenous Archival Photo Project, an online and physical exhibition of archival Indigenous photographs that explores history, identity, and the process of visual reclamation. His photo book, Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, was published by Knopf in Canada in October 2019, which is a stunning book, and I highly recommend you take a look at it. It's quite beautiful, and was Saskatchewan's One Book, One Province title for 2021, as well as being Saskatchewan's Book of the Year as juried by the Saskatchewan Writers Guild for 2020. Gaze Canthanetta Horn and the 1960s is his next book, which will be also published by Knopf Canada in 2022. His writings have appeared in the Globe and Mail, The Walrus, Brick, Granta, Maclean's, among other magazines. His writings, Paul Seesequasis was one of the authors to be selected and featured as part of Canada's official literary delegation for the 2021 Frankfurt International Book Fair, which I was also invited to attend as a host. So I probably would have been introducing you there too, Paul. He has curated several photography exhibitions, including enclosing some snapshots, the photography of Métis activist James Brady, which opened at the Glenbow in Calgary in 2020 and will be open at the Galt in Lethbridge in fall 2021. Part of a Western Canadian tour, and he's curated several other exhibitions over the past 5 years. He's a member of the Saskatchewan Writers Guild and has commented extensively on cultural issues in the media such as CBC TV, APTN, Global, CTV TV, among others. So I'm just very grateful and happy to welcome Paul into Decolonizing the Narrative sessions.
Tanse, Renata, it's good to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
And I hope everyone can hear me nice and clear. I am, as Renata said, speaking from Saskatoon, Treaty 6 territories and traditional homeland of the Métis here on the prairies. And I'm very grateful for Renata for all the kind words and for the Banff Centre as well for inviting me to host what I hope will be an informative talk. And also Tanse and Toao, welcome to everyone from whatever territory or area you're zooming into this webinar. I'll just say a couple quick words about the Indigenous Archival Photo Project. It's been quite a journey. It began 7, 8 years ago. I've lost track of time in that sense of the word, but I've always had a deep interest in photography. I'm not much of a photographer myself, but it's always something that's inspired me, and imagery is always, as we know, is so much a part of our world today. The project began really with no plan. It was just responding to something my mother had said, who's a residential school survivor. She's passed last fall, but she had made a comment that while the Truth and Reconciliation Commission meetings were going on, and she was one of the witnesses as a survivor of residential schools. But she had also made a comment that we weren't hearing enough about the strength and resiliency of people during those hardest of times, and little acts of resistance, not just big acts of resistance, but little acts of resistance and determination that kept language, culture, kinship, community, and all the threads that bind us alive. So in the face of all those things, residential schools, the past system, colonialism, this has sustained us. And so I began to look for photography and photographic images that would bear some witness to this. And as I posted these on social media, and this project and this work could not happen without the internet, I began to research museums, archives, libraries, and eventually private collections. And I found as I posted these photographs on social media, they began to reframe the photograph. The photograph was given a new life. Often it was, that's my auntie, that's my uncle, that's my grandfather. Then someone else would have a story that went along with that person. Often these photos had not been seen before by people who were family members or people in the communities. So it kind of brought together bridged this void that existed between the image that was in a museum or a gallery or an archive and the community that it was divorced from. And that act of visual reclamation is really one of the most important parts of the Indigenous Archival Photo Project. I think it's allowed a new narrative to develop on these photos. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Indigenous Archival Photo Project is. It is images of Indigenous peoples in different communities across the Americas now, often taken by non-Indigenous photography. But I was always looking for photos that kind of fit inside a frame of showing that strength, joy, humor, which we also didn't hear enough of, and also that act of naming, of reclamation, of that image going back to the community and that community coming back to the image. And that's really at the heart of it. What I would like to do now is start a PowerPoint. So I'll ask if Angela can queue up the first slide, and I will speak to that and take you on a little journey. I hope that's interesting for you, and will keep you informed and entertained over the next 40 minutes or so. So if we could bring up the PowerPoint, that would be awesome. Thank you, Angela. Martin Chambee is probably one of the first Indigenous photographers, if not the first, in the Americas. He was Gwich'ta from in Peru. He grew up in a poor working class family, but he came across photography, and his photos reframed and reshaped, I think, a new image narrative that ran contrary to the colonial narrative of Peru, that brought forward the Inca reality and the Incan people, and gave them a dignity, and also that I start with him because he is an insider's gaze, not an outsider's gaze. He was the first, or one of the first Indigenous photographers in the Americas. As we see in this portrait here of an extended family, which is, I think it's 1926, if I remember correctly, with their potato harvest. And of course, potatoes also being the traditional Incan food that ended up going around the world. But if you look at this photograph, you can see just, these are obviously not rich people, but you can see their pride, their sense of self, their kinship. And I think that comes across in this and other Martin Shamby photos. So if you don't know his work, I encourage you to look him up. Not just for the beauty of his images, but you'll learn a lot, I think, of Incan life in the early decades of the 20th century. And I just want to read a quote from Martin Shamby because it kind of encapsulates what he was about. Quote, "I have read that in Chile, people think that Indians have no culture, that they are not civilized, that they are intellectually and artistically inferior to whites and Europeans. More eloquent is my opinion, at least the graphic testimony. My hope is for a more impartial and objective examination, which reveals this. I think I am representative of my race, my people. I speak up through my photographies." Martin Shamby, 1936. If we can go to the second slide. Horst Pulau was a Kiowa photographer. Spent most of his life in Oklahoma, near traditional Kiowa territory. And also, again, another of this first generation of Indigenous photographers, again, an inside eye. And why I think Pulau's work is important is he reflected not only Indigenous people in regalia or powwows, but he also took photos of day-to-day life. He took photos at weddings, at funerals, at parades, as we see right here in this photograph. He took photographs also of during the war. He was an aerial photographer, etc. It's interesting, while he was today as recognized as a formative Indigenous photographer, during his lifetime, he never had a single exhibition. It was his family brought together his first exhibition toward the end of his life. And I think only now is his photography. It's been shown at the museum, at the Smithsonian, Washington. There's a book, For a Love of His People, hardcover book of his photography that's come out. And his photography has really influenced a new generation of contemporary Indigenous photographers who look to him for inspiration and see him as one of the founders of what is the Indigenous history of photography in the Americas. So I think it's appropriate he's the second slide. And I just want to read something that was written about him by a writer and curator, Rebecca Bengal. Quote, "The element of performance in Pulau's photographs allowed his subjects to have some control over their own images. They controlled themselves as they felt they were or they wanted to be seen. This is true of his field portraits of dancers wearing full regalia in ceremonies or of couples donning their Sunday best. These pictures upend the colonial narrative and image record. The Indian did not vanish, but she could cut off her braids if she so desired. The warrior could ride a horse or a brand new car. Pulau's photographs are revolutionary in their joyfulness and subversive in their embrace of change," unquote. Slide 3, please. This is one of many photos that Edward S. Curtis took in the last decades of the 1800s, in the early decades of the 1900s. He was, of course, a settler photographer, and he did his 6-volume series on the American Indian. It is a series which has caused a lot of, I think, curatorial and critical discussion. And it's important to see Edward S. Curtis in this light, and also in the light of photography in general. We have to remember that photography really only began to break out of the studio and out of the slow development process around the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s. So the camera itself very much fit in with the whole concept of manifest destiny and the colonization of the West. So it's both a tool of conquest, and it was also a tool that was used to frame Indigenous peoples as artifacts, as cultures of the past, as being a vanishing race, as of being framed within a dress of regalia or feathers or beads, and particularly with an emphasis on the prairie nations. So I think we have to see Edward S. Curtis in this light, and also see Edward S. Curtis, the value that was in his travels, recording all the different nations that he did do, but also keeping in mind that he was all his photos involved regalia or ceremony. He was not interested in photographing Indigenous people as they were or how they are living at the time he was even taking these photographs. He wanted to see them within this framework of both the vanishing race and this other settler gaze of which he's finding in photography, which is the romanticization and the trope of the Native person just being part of regalia or powwow. In her book, the critic Susan Sontag wrote, quote, "The predatory side of photography is at the heart of the alliance between photography and tourism. Serious amateur photographers had been operating in the West since the end of the American Civil War. They were the vanguard of an army of tourists who arrived by the end of the century, eager for a good shot at Indian life. The tourists invaded the Indians' privacy, photographing holy objects and the sacred dances in places, if necessary, paying the Indians to pose and getting them to revise their ceremonies to provide more photogenic material," unquote. We can go to the next slide, please. This photo was taken by another non-Indigenous photographer, a fairly well-known one, Geraldine Moody, here in Canada. She traveled, lived in Alberta, Saskatchewan, traveled up in the Arctic, and took photos both of Plains cultures, but also of Inuit cultures in the Arctic, which includes this studio portrait here of Koktatuk. And that's how her name is recorded by Geraldine Moody. Whether it's a proper spelling or not is very much up to doubt. What we do know is she was a deaf Inuk young woman, and Geraldine took this portrait, which did end up being on Canadian stamps. At least this, in her photography, or this photo in particular, she did go to the extent of trying to write down the name. With so much Arctic photography taken by the outside gaze, particularly in the north in the Arctic, the photographers did not bother to get the names of the Inuit peoples they were framing within their photographs. They were simply using the photo to capture what they saw as something exotic, something that was disappearing, and to reframe it and represent it for a Southern gaze. So you always have that dichotomy when you're looking at photography from this period. And it also bears witness in Geraldine Moody's diaries that she was a photographer of her time. She wrote, she attended a Sundance once, and she got to see the quote, "the red man paint and adorn himself and his horses." young, he uses the S word, women make themselves as gay as vermilion. They wear beads and gaudy clothes and sing weird songs and drumming, unquote. So while is some merit within the photography herself, the attitude of the photographers this photographer is very evident within her diaries. We can go to the next slide, please. Slide 5. This is one more Horace Pula photo. And I selected this photo because it has several elements to it. Firstly, this is his brother, Bruce Pulau, is on the far right there. Leaning against the car is the woman is Lucy Nokeler, who would be Horace Pulau's future sister-in-law. She would eventually marry Bruce, who's on the far right there. And she also at this time was traveling the United States under the performing title of Princess Watuwasu. And so what she would do is dress up in tribal regalia, sing songs, tell stories, but she also told jokes. And she also, while she was playing to the gaze and the trope of the Indian princess, quote unquote, which is of course colonial fabrication, and she was playing into it. She at the same time was subverting that message with not just her shows, but how she was. So she, in her own ways, was a rebellious and revolutionary performer. And this is again reflects something that Pulau was doing, was just taking the day-to-day life around the Kiowa nation and how people dressed. And here everyone is in their Sunday best as they're about to embark on a road trip to New York City. And it's 1930. Let's do slide 6, the next one. This is one of the snapshots taken by Métis photographer James Brady, who was an activist, an organizer, a writer, as well as a photographer. And I recently curated, as was mentioned, a show at the Glenbow, which is now in Lethbridge, and this fall will be going on to Saskatchewan, called Enclosing Some Snapshots. And what's interesting about James Brady, who disappeared on a prospecting trip in northern Saskatchewan in 1967, and when he was not found, his estate, a friend of his, donated his photographs to the Glenbow in Calgary. And it's really was an important thing that he did that. The photographs could have possibly been destroyed or disappeared or just eroded with time. But James Brady took hundreds of snapshots from the 1930s through to his disappearance in the mid-1960s. And what they are snapshots of mostly of Métis and Cree families, individuals, and communities that he traveled to. And he had this, because of his life, he also served overseas in the Second World War. He was very much a traveler, along with his lifelong political friend, Malcolm Norris. And so what his snapshots for me reflect is the kinship and the dignity of the Cree and Métis settlements during the days of the pass system, during the days of the road allowance. He, I think, shows the hardworking side of these communities, the fact that they are survivors. And we don't know what he intended with his snapshots, whether they were just meant as something for him to remember the communities by, whether he ever intended to have them published in a book, exhibited, whatever, we don't know. But we can be grateful that he left this legacy with us. And I was very honored to work on this, on his first photographic exhibition. Next slide, please. Another of this first generation of Indigenous photographers is Peter Pitsirak. He grew up mostly around Kingate, and along with his wife, was given a camera by a missionary and began to take photographs in the early 1940s. And he was a self-taught photographer. And more than that, the couple learned how to do, because they were in Kingate up in Dorset, they had no way to develop film other than to send it to the south. And at that time, it would have been by ship. It would have taken months. So they developed their own dark room, beginning in an igloo, using flashlight and a red cloth, and teaching themselves how to develop their own photos. So in this photograph, this is a timed self-portrait that Peter took. You can see him with, I believe her name's Amy Manning, who's one of his, I guess you'd say, nieces. And again, it's not an outside gaze. His photography was very much for the community. He wanted to capture, in many of his shots, hunting, fishing excursions, because he knew the lifestyle, as all lifestyles do, were changing, and he wants to leave that record. And we can be grateful that he did. Next slide, please. George Johnson is an interesting character. He's a Tlingit. He was a Tlingit businessman, entrepreneur, trapper, store owner, and photographer who lived in Teslin, Yukon. And he again is another of this generation of entirely self-taught photojournalists, if you will. And there's this interesting side story to this photo, which is one of these great narratives that comes out as these archived photos are shared. That car in the background is painted white. So I'm guessing this photo was taken in early spring, because what George Johnson would do, he brought up a 1929 Chevy up the Teslin River. There were no roads at the time reaching Teslin, so he had to bring it up by raft. Once he got the car to Teslin, with the help of the community, they built a road so the car could travel from one end of the community to the other. In the wintertime, he put chains on the tires so that the car could travel up and down the frozen river. And he also began in the 1940s what is likely the first Indigenous owned and run taxi service in Teslin, serving the community of a few hundred people. And this photograph was taken around that, soon after the taxi service began. And one of the women, Angela Karsick, said this about the photo, quote, "We went back to Teslin and Johnson would take this picture of us with his own camera. We were all standing in front of his car by his house in Teslin. Fanny and I were posing with Johnson wearing the new clothes and hats that we bought in Whitehorse. I was 16 years old in that picture. He took another photograph of us that included my mom and dad, and I think his daughter, Dolly. Johnson would drive us back to Lower Post after this visit with Laird Tom," unquote. So again, there are other photos that George Johnson take, which is well worth looking up at the Yukon Archives. Girls' baseball team, some trapping photos, etc. So again, this is George Johnson. Next slide, please. Again, we're dealing with snapshots, and as the Indigenous Archival Photo Project has gone beyond archives and museums, I've started to encounter more private collections or have people share photos with me. And these are family snapshots. And what's wonderful about family snapshots is often people wrote on them, either on the front or on the back, on the border, as you see here in 1944, and Ruth and Phyllis. Ruth and Phyllis are two sisters, kins of Barbara Parchman, who's a Métis historian, writer, and anthropologist who lives in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. And she shared this photo with me, and I think it's a really important photo, not just for her kinship, but that lake, that body of water you see in the background is Lac Peltier, which is one of the Métis settlements that existed in western Saskatchewan from the late 1880s up to the 1930s, when the last of the Métis families were dispersed. So the only thing left of the Métis settlements at Lac Peltier now is a plaque and the foundations, stone foundations of some houses. Lac Peltier itself is mostly cottages now owned by people in Swift Current or tourists visiting. So the photograph is also relevant in that way. It's a reminder in a frame of a community that no longer exists. I just want to quote Barbara Parchman on this. Quote, "The candid family photos from her younger years fills in the gaps of my grandmother's life at the lake. They are a rare gift that tells a story, aside from the formal portraits, from within the community, rather than the colonial viewpoint of European photographers, anthropologists, and others passing through. They tell a story of a strong community from the Métis perspective. They capture the joy in family picnics and local celebrations and pumpkin harvests with my cousins. While names and dates may not always be accurate, the pictures hold a truth that words cannot express. They speak of an important time in the history of the lake, and they solidify my connection to these people and this valley," unquote. Next slide, please. This portrait of a worker with a hard hat driving a truck and wearing aviator sunglasses. And it was taken by George LeGrady. George LeGrady is academic, curator, photographer, lecturer. He's based in, I believe right now in Southern California, in LA. But when he was a young man in 1973, he ran into Billy Diamond in a bar in Montreal. Billy Diamond would go on to be Grand Chief of the James Cree Nation. And Billy Diamond found out he was a photographer and invited him up to the James Bay area to take some photos of some elders. George LeGrady ended up coming up a second time and staying for a long period of time. And he spent a lot of time in that James Bay, in the Cree communities in the James Bay region. And at the time the photographs were taken, the James Bay Cree were beginning to mobilize into a political entity. This would be 1973. They were just about to enter into negotiations with the Quebec government over land rights due to the construction of the monumental James Bay hydroelectric project over sovereign Cree land. So this began one of the biggest legal and political battles over land rights in Canadian history in the early 1970s. And it was exactly at this period of time of political awakening and organizing and the impending change of the eventual dams that would be built that would forever see communities moved, the rivers changed, lifestyles changed, etc. So it's really an important time that James LeGrady was up there. And what is also important about James LeGrady's photographs is he has gone beyond just having them exist in a museum or a collection of at a gallery or something, but has gone back to the community, has shown the photographs there, has gifted the photographs to the community. Some of them are on display there. So it's an example of a photographer keeping a reciprocal ethical relationship with the community they're taking photos from. Next slide, please. This photograph was taken in the 1930s in Alberta. It's a Tsuut'ina First Nation just out south of Calgary. And the photographer is an interesting guy named Arnold Lupson. I curated an exhibit of his photography at the Nickel Galleries in Calgary a few years ago now. And Arnold Lupson took hundreds of photographs of Tsuut'ina the Tsuut'ina Nation, but also of the neighboring Blackfoot reserves at that time. Being an Englishman, his gaze initially was attracted, of course, similar to Edward Curtis and other settler photographers, to regalia and ceremony. But he went beyond that and began to just take pictures of day-to-day life. And that it was those pictures I was interested in curating and putting on exhibit in Calgary. And one of the women I met in Calgary is from Tsuut'ina. Her name is Glenna Cardinal. And speaking with her was really important. And what Glenna Cardinal did was arrange to have the prints from the Nico Gallery after the exhibit was over, go back to the community and the First Nation. And this is important because the community, while Arnold Lupson was an Englishman, he did marry into the family there. He did live in and pass away on the reserve. And his photography is very much an important part of that community. So again, it's another example of a visual repatriation, I guess. And I also give credit to the Glenbow Museum for making this also possible, as many museums now are beginning to sort of decolonize their thinking regarding photography collections, and not just ensuring accuracy and naming of photography and the photographs, but also that the prints themselves, if it's possible, should and can be restored to the communities that they are a part of. And it's only through that process that you take those photos and liberate them from the outside gaze and return them to the families and kins from which they have a different relevance and a more heartfelt, immediate relevance. Next slide, please. This photograph is an interesting photograph. It's the Glueckart family and Taylorioke, which was called Spence Bay at the time. And again, this is an interesting photo because it as well was taken in 1973 by a photographer called Pamela Harris. Pamela Harris is an important photographer in the 70s and still is. She did a number of photographs on the feminist movement, etc. But she also ended up going up to the far north and up to Spence Bay in 1973. She was invited up there as part of a craft project and then invited back to the community a few months later. And Pamela Harris looked out for and found out some funding from Kodak camera, as well as the government of Northwest Territories. And she was able to actually bring darkroom equipment up with her. So she brought up darkroom equipment, printmaking supplies and chemicals, and cameras. And her intention was to leave the darkroom equipment in Taylorioke, as well as all the cameras, all the chemicals, etc., and to gift them to the community. But for the darkroom to work, you had to have a darkroom, of course. So in the women's craft center at the time, with the agreement of the women, they kind of commandeered the women's washroom and turned it into the darkroom. As there was a sink there, you could turn off lights and it was dark enough to develop film. Then the next thing Pamela did was she's very cognizant of not directing the gaze of these Inuit women. So she gave them the cameras and told them to take pictures of what they wanted to take. Initially, the photographs were, as could be expected, were mostly photos of the kids, of their kids, etc. But then their eye began to expand, and they taking photos of them, of the landscape around, of them hunting, going on fishing trips, of them collecting lichen, etc. So the photographs themselves became the creation of the Inuit women of the community. And one of the women, Selena Tuktu, went on to teach photography at a local school, and her and two other Inuk women were exhibited later, a couple of years later, in Toronto. So I think the Darkroom project, pre-digital age, was an important intervention and important legacy in the history of Indigenous photography in Canada. Next slide, please. This slide in this photograph was taken by Rosemary Joliet Eaton, again another English person, an English woman who came to Canada in the early 1950s as a photojournalist, which at the time, and still is, a very male-dominated profession. At the time, it was almost completely male-dominated. So she found it a bit odd and awkward to fit in. So along with her companion, Doris Heineman, she went on a road trip across Canada. And on the way, she traveled through several reserves and began to take photographs of Indigenous peoples as she traveled across the country. And eventually she secured some money and was able to travel north to Kingate, which at the time was Cape Dorset, and to Frobisher Bay, which is now Iqaluit. And there she spent quite an extensive bit of time, got to know people, and gradually people became comfortable with her. And she began to take photographs of the community, particularly women in the community, at work, in the kitchen, taking care of their children. And in this particular photo, which is an Apex, which is just on the outskirts of Iqaluit, the two women who were later named through the project and also in partnership with Project Naming are having a rest after unloading a barge. And it's just a marvelous photo. And I just wanted to bring her photos up because they've been an important part of the project in the past number of years. So again, her name is Rosemary Joliet Eaton, and you can find the collection of her photographs. Much of it has been digitized, hundreds of photographs at Library and Archives Canada. Next slide, please. When I talked earlier about the history of photography and the camera being weaponized and the camera framing Indigenous people as a being of the past, tintype was one of the a type of photography that was used. It's a complex developing method that lets but it allowed photographers to break out of the studio and take pictures in the field, so to speak, or on the street. And it reached its peak popularity in the 1860s through the 1880s. And many of the first photographs of Indigenous peoples that were seen in the East, particularly during the Manifest Destiny and the colonization of the West, were taken with tintype and were what we talked about earlier, just pre-Edward Curtis of the idea of the vanishing race, etc. What's interesting now is that contemporary Indigenous photographers are reclaiming the tintype and this process to reframe and repurpose this type of photography. Casca Dene photographer Kaylee Spitzer is one such person, as well as Dene photographer Will Wilson. And I just want to read a quote from Will Wilson on his use of tintype photography, contemporary use of tintype photography. Quote, "There's this Hollywood adage about Indians fearing photography because of its capacity to steal the soul. I think that Indigenous people coming from oral traditions have a very nuanced understanding of the power and capacity of descriptive representation, and therefore approach the medium with a healthy degree of suspicion and skepticism. So it's from that foundation that this project is indigenizing the photographic exchange and the tintype." Next slide, please. I'm going to go a bit faster on these last slides because we're just getting down to our last 10 minutes or so here. This is a wonderful photo of a group of Dene children in the Northwest Territories. It was taken by Rennie Fumilo. He is one of the photographers I interviewed for Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun. At the time I interviewed him, he would have been in his early 90s. He's since passed on. He was also a priest. He also traveled across Denida, and he developed relationships with many Dene in many communities up there, became quite well known. And at the time of the Berger inquiry, was very active with the Dene in their lobbying against the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, which again, we're talking the early 1970s. He was also an amateur photographer, and his love and appreciation of the Dene is evidenced in this photo of these children. When René Femulu passed a few years ago, he asked for and was given the honor of being buried in the Denide community near Yellowknife. So again, he's a photographer. His collection is at the Northwest Territory Archives, digitized there, and it's well worth having a look at them. Next slide, please. I want to finish with talking about contemporary Indigenous photography and contemporary Indigenous photography as a tool of activism, as a tool of resistance, as a tool of resilience, and the idea of photography on the front lines, the insider gaze. This photograph here was taken at by Edgar at the Freeland camp outside of the capital of Brasilia in January 2019. And this was right at the time that the Bolsonaro government, which had just been voted in January 2019, was looking at selling off vast tracts of the Amazon forest for ranching and farming to settlers at the expense of the Indigenous peoples living there. So close to 100 tribal members established a free land camp on the outskirts of Brasilia, and that's when this photograph was taken. And it captures the activism that continues to this day in Brazil. To the next slide, please. Mara Barragon is an Imbera photographer in Panama. And again, I'm framing her photography as photography challenging and reinforcing survivance, and the fact that the Imbera, who have been, like all Indigenous nations, very much colonized, are regaining both language and tradition. And in this self-portrait, she's wearing traditional jewelry and the traditional Imbera body painting. And I just want to read a quote from Amara. "Through photography, I find the means of visibility, of beauty, importance. What's more, the urgency to reconcile with the worldview of our ancestors, expressed in traditional designs that remind us of the need for balanced coexistence with our Mother Earth. We know that our culture is closely linked to respect for Mother Earth. By revaluing our identity and cultural empowerment, we are ensuring a harmonious and environmentally balanced future," unquote. Last slide, please. Cara Romero is another contemporary Indigenous photographer who's done some great work. She currently is part of a collective that has a series of billboards that is up actually right now through parts of Los Angeles, reminding inhabitants of Los Angeles, both non-Indigenous, Indigenous, and displaced and recent immigrant, that this is Talawa land. And the the billboards feature contemporary Indigenous photographers, including Cara O'Mara. Each of our photographic series references the intersection of contemporary life and Native American and challenge Native American stereotypes. As Ashley says, quote, my intention is to create a critical visibility for modern natives, to get away from that one story narrative and to dig into our multiple identities and our diversity and our humor. And we see that in this photograph, which is from our Coyote series, taken outside of the Sinner's Bar. And with that, I want to conclude the PowerPoint presentation. I hope you've enjoyed the journey with me, and just to again thank the Banff Centre, Renata, and everyone there for having me today, for giving me the opportunity to speak. It's been a pleasure. Oh. And I also very much look forward to discussing further the Indigenous Archival Project, any other questions you may have. And all your questions and other things will be looked at. And with Renata, we'll be back to a question and answer period tomorrow. And I'll let Renata explain the details of that. Thank you, Renata. Hi.
Oh my God. Oh, that was incredible. I'm just like, I'm bursting with questions. I'm bursting with inspiration. And also like, you know, I've followed the social media element to the naming of people within this. And I've just witnessed, you know, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, I've really witnessed the joy of discovery of relatives that you've created for these different communities, and it's always been quite an inspiration. So in what you've shared, so much context, so much understanding, and just I love this perspective of gaze, Northern gaze, Southern gaze, Indigenous gaze, non-Indigenous gaze, and just the eras of those. So I'm really excited to talk about that tomorrow. So yes, tomorrow we'll do a Q&A with some of the questions that I have, questions that you have. So please put questions in the chat and come here tomorrow where we'll kind of dig in a little bit more about the work that Paul has shared. And, you know, this wouldn't have been possible without the support of RBC, who's a big funder of Indigenous Arts, as well as the Slate Foundation and Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. And so again, just like someone was shared, like my eyes are opened. It really has inspired a lot. So I can't wait. I cannot wait for our chat tomorrow.
I'm looking forward to it, Renata.
Excellent. Good afternoon. Titu Atira Renata Arluke. So Renata Arluke, Director of Indigenous Arts, coming to you from Treaty 7 territory here in Banff National Park. Beautiful rainy day. Grateful for rain. Couldn't be more grateful for rain. Just thinking about our province neighbors in BC and just how they've received rain as well, and just thinking about them and their families, and hoping that families are staying safe and being safe, and that you know, that their communities are safe as well. It's been pretty scary lately. I just want to say how incredibly inspiring yesterday's session was with you, Paul, that your presentation was just so incredible, so in depth, outreaching, and really insightful. And I learned quite a bit. You know, and I've been following you on social media for the years that you started working on this, and I learned a heck of a lot yesterday.
Thank you, Renata. I really appreciate that. It means a lot to me.
We've known each other for a while, and you've always had such an incredible connection to community and the practice that you have. And I guess the big question that I had was, what really inspired you to start looking at these images, and like what was kind of one of the first images you saw that really sparked that curiosity?
Time, it seems so long ago now. It's at least 8 years that this project has been going on for. It was the genesis of it was some words my mother who had said, who was a residential school survivor from St. Michael's Residential School, which is just was outside of Duck Lake. It burnt down a number of years ago. But she just commented that during the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission meetings that we were just surrounded by, all the things that were coming out that we know about, but the general population really did not, or still does not really appreciate the extent of it, of the abuse and cultural erasure and everything else that was going on in residential schools. But my mom had made a comment that got me thinking. She had said that through those most difficult of years, there's not enough attention is being paid to the kinships and the family bonds and our elders who kept language and culture alive despite all the attempts to erase it. And that got me inspired to look for reflections of that, I guess. And I've always been kind of driven by images and imagery, and we live in a very, as we know, photogenic kind of society, Instagram, TikTok, everything that we have around us. So that it just inspired me to begin to look for photographs from around my mother's generation when she would have been a girl or a teenager. And I began to look at libraries, museums, archives, to find kind of an alternative framing of Indigenous existence that wasn't just doom and gloom, or wasn't just centered on being a victim, or centered on photographs from residential schools themselves. I wanted it to show another side, because we know that other side. We know that other side contains love and humor and a lot of other things that, you travel to Indigenous communities, and, we're very diverse culturally in terms of language, which, how the land is, all that stuff that shapes us. But there are some commonalities, and humor is one of them. So I began to look for those kind of photos. And since I was using the internet to do the research and relying on digitized collections, that sort of thing, at museums, archives, I began to kind of post them on social media, and the response was quite phenomenal. In a lot of instances, these photos were not named. They were taken by non-Indigenous photographers. So not only would people say, that's my auntie, that's my uncle, that's me, but this kind of oral narrative began to roll out, particularly on Facebook, where people would say that's Joe, and Joe did this, and I remember Joe, he lived next door to so-and-so. I remember that time he got lost, or whatever. All these stories came out. So suddenly the photograph had a narrative to it. Suddenly the photograph was more than just item number 746842 in Library and Archives Canada. It was actually part of that community, and it was part of that, engaged again with that community. It's like the photograph came to life. So that was really how it began.
Amazing. And I really, looking at the ones from the North specifically, like you mentioned Renee Fumalo, who is a really well-respected community member. And he went up to the North. He's a poet. He has published books in poetry, and he came up to the North to be a priest, and then denounced his priesthood and realized he had more to learn from the community than what to bring into the community. And that you can see that through his lens of his work as a photographer. But it was a lot of the church that captured a lot of those images, other than the people that you presented yesterday. But there is a great record of photography that was done through the church and then kept in those church archives. And wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that, like if that was something that you had researched, or if that was something that you came across, or that you noticed a bit of a pattern of as well.
Oh, certainly, Renata. And it wasn't a lot of the church archives, such as the Anglican Church has a huge archive, etc., were photos from the residential schools themselves. And that was really something I was veering away from. Firstly, the Truth and Reconciliation website had, they've archived a lot of those images and all the residential schools. What I wanted to do was try to find alternate sources for the photographs. So it involved doing some research. People like Renee, Rosemary Gilliat, and I'm just naming off the non-Indigenous ones, right? Rosemary Gilliat, Eaton, John McPhee, who was a photographer in Northwestern Ontario. The non-Indigenous photographers who had some relationship with the, like Renee did up in Northwest Territories, had some sort of relationship with the communities. They were there long enough. I wasn't interested in photographers who kind of flew in and flew out, and I wasn't interested in kind of a savior kind of photography. I was interested in some sort of embedding and relationship between community and the camera, the lens. And I think with people like photographers like Renee Fumolo, Rosemary Gilliat, you can see that there is a trust and intimacy with the photographer, and that's so key and so important. So photography is always, as we know, photography is can be a very intrusive medium. Your image is taken. You don't necessarily control what happens to it afterward. You may not have legal resource to stop misuse of your image. The image may be used out of context. There's so many issues that I could spend the next hour listing, doing a list of all the things that are bad and that's bad about photography, and particularly photography of Indigenous peoples. But with people like Renee and Rosemary, there was a respect, I guess would be the first word that comes to mind. There was a respect, and obviously the photographer cared enough about that community, about who they were photographing, to try and not just capture a beautiful image or capture that person's personality or what they're doing, but also took the care to try and get the names, to try and be accurate in the framing of not just the image, but what the caption that goes with the image. So that was really what I was trying to find, as opposed to the kind of framing that you see when we see mostly the church archives and that sort of thing. I was going in an entirely different direction than that.
Yeah. In Fort Smith, I only mentioned this was because it was often the technology accessibility was to non-Indigenous people. So in our community of Fort Smith, we had Brother John. And so a lot of the community members remember Brother John, who had a camera and took pictures, and he took aerial photos. He took pictures of families. He did family portraits, and he got much older, and he had reached out to my cousin Melanie, and he got her to digitize his images. And then she started capturing them visually, with her visual art, with pens, different color pens, and kind of she kind of resurged those images into her art. And what I think what made it, so it was often the church that had the technology, but what was so powerful about George in Yukon is he ordered himself a camera and then opened up the world through Indigenous lens, which was so powerful. And I was pretty happy to see his car, his taxi cab car, and kind of get a sense of what that world was then through a community lens.
Yeah. No, I think that's very key, and just from what you're saying, yes, and certainly people like Renee also, as amateur photographers, they really left a legacy of an important period of time, and so many. We're always in change and flux and stuff. So the fact that these photographers were around at that time was really important. George Johnson, of course, in the Yukon, Peter Pitsilik in Cape Dorset, etc. And that's going back to the 40s, So, and just when they first, that kind of transition from the camera being completely in the outsider's control and directed through the outsider gaze to the first time an Indigenous person, through however it's given to them or however they get it, has their own camera in their hand. You can see that kind of that being kind of that transition and the birth of the insider gaze. And to me, that was really exciting to see when that happens. And there are many instances of that happening. Mosa Michael, who was one of the first Inuk, the first Inuk filmmaker, he made a few films for the NFB in the early 70s. He began photography because Rosemary Joliet let him use her camera while she was up there back in 1960, when he would have been, I don't know, 7, 8, 9. No, he's probably a bit older, about 10 or 11 at that time. Yeah. And he became, the first Inuk filmmaker. So this, you can see when those things happen, how people get inspired by it. And when those stories start to come out, it's really interesting. And I hope not just for me, but for anyone who's following the project.
What was like some of the big surprises that came as you're starting to go into this world and these different worlds? What kind of just was the big surprise?
I think the surprise was how lucky I was to start, when I started doing the project and it eventually became Blanket Toss under Midnight Sun, how lucky I was with the timing. I got to talk to Rennie Fuminal. I got to talk to John McPhee. I got to talk to a number of people who are in those photos who have since passed on. Many of these people were already in their late 80s, early 90s. So the stories I was able to get, in many cases, would be gone with the person. So it was really, I think there's just really fortunate for me to, the timing just happened to happen when it did. If I'd started the project now, it'd be too late. Renee's gone, John McPhee's gone. A lot of the people I interviewed are gone. It would have been a different kind of book. So it was just that timing. To me, that was, when I look back on it, that's, I guess the gift of it, or the biggest surprise for me, is that it happened when it happened. It wasn't, like I said earlier, I think yesterday, I didn't come out with a template. I didn't, okay, stage 1, I'm going to post these photos. Stage 2, this is going to happen. Stage 3, Penguin is going to offer me a book contract. None of that was, none of that was planned out. It just kind of came together. So that's the first surprise. The second surprise, I think, was how these photographs resonated with people out in wherever they are, but through the internet, and how people responded to them, and how people constructed narratives and stories, provided names, and it just brought, it was like, there's a different layer to the image. It just not only gave context, but it gave life to the photographs. It gave story to the photographs, and how that came together, I think, was a pleasant surprise, and it still is. It still is. Now with the project, it's kind of morphed in different directions. I initially started off, and until very recently, primarily focused on what we now call the state of Canada and Indigenous imagery within Canada. It's now expanding to the States and through the Americas. So I'm very excited to see that network start to happen, and also work, to be in communication with and promoting and following the work of so many talented contemporary Indigenous artists, photographers, image makers is perhaps a better word, because when we think about photographers, we tend to just think about people just snapping a photo and just dealing with photography. And so many of these photographers are doing so much more than that with the photography and the images. So that also is really exciting to see. So I'm glad to see the project kind of go in that that direction. The other side to it, I think, is and I forgot my train of thought here. The other side of it is just I initially was restricted, not restricted, but I was relying a lot on a lot of the research was coming from museums, archives, galleries, libraries, historical societies, provincial archives, federal archives, all those places. In the past number of years, I've had several private collections sent to me. I've had, someone would email me and say, my dad was a doctor up north in the Arctic in the 50s, and he took all these photographs. They've been sitting in a drawer. They've been sitting in a drawer for, for a couple of decades. He's passed on. Would you be interested in seeing them? And then out of that, we come to an agreement. I start to post them, and then we start to get the names. And in several cases, the family or the family's estate has helped to ensure that a collection of photographs gets to the community that that person was stationed in and took those photographs. So I think that brings a nice closure to to say that doctor who took those photographs was known in that community. He passes on, but his collection through the family then is sent to me. I get in touch with someone through social media in that community, and then we close the circle. The photographs go back to the community, and I do really like the idea of those prints going directly back to the community and not being restricted to museums or collections in some sort in any institution. I really like the idea of blowing up the institutions and getting the photographs back to the community. So when that happens, it's great to see.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Oh, I'm just going to finish, and I don't want to say that every art museum or archive is hoarding their collections and is not making the effort to embark on some sort of reclamation or visual reclamation with communities. I know that's happening. I know different institutions are now doing that, whether it's Library and Archives Canada through project naming. I know at the Glenbow, when I did we talked about them yesterday, the Arnold Lufsen exhibit in Calgary. Glenna Cardinal, who is from Sustina, came. I spoke with her, and she, after that exhibit closed, the Glenbow, the prints from that exhibit were given to Glenna for her to take back to the First Nation. So when that's kind of thing starts to happen, that's really rewarding, and that's kind of what I'm talking about, of getting away from just these being part of archives or museums or art collections and being living entities that go back to the community itself.
Yeah. Well, we have, like, our knowledge is story, but our images also are part of that knowledge. Like, those images are they're provocations of a time. And I think when we looked at the one with the horse, and you were talking about on the Peltier River or Lac Peltier.
Oh, Lac Peltier, yes.
Yeah, like, just when you were sharing about the woman who was like, this showed that we existed on this land and that this land was part of our territory, and now there's cottages that are there that kind of erase that relationship. And so when there's some, when we think about contemporary artists or contemporary artisans, they talk about how their images are on social media to prove that they exist. And so those images are so powerful that we can identify them and that we can connect to them, as an ancestor, as a next generation. Like, on Facebook, I'm part of the Inuvialuit one, and there's Amos Tuma is always posting images from the communities. And how many times have I seen my great grandmother, sitting there around a drum dance, or she's like eating at a table with her friends, and it's something very powerful about having the accessibility to it. and understanding the context and the relation to the people within that, and knowing that I exist because of that, because she existed and I get to see her exist. And there I feel like I have an even more connection to her, even though she's long gone.
Oh, I think that's a really good point, Renata. And just when you mentioned Lac Peltier, yes, certainly with the Lac Peltier Métis settlement, those family snapshots are, like, as you said, the evidence that that community was there. And you'll find that with several Métis settlements where the photographs that were taken are the evidence now, because particularly in Saskatchewan, a lot of those Métis settlements eventually were dispersed and cottagers moved in, or large agriculture moved in, and the families were either bought out or decided to move or were forced out. So those photographs become part of that living history to show that, yes, they were there. And there was a vibrant community there. Another side, which is you find a lot within both Canada and the United States, going back to the early part of the 20th century, is the photographs of First Nations or Métis people who were living in what is now Banff National Park, or who were living in what is now Jasper, or Prince Albert National Park in Saskatchewan. And those families, including Mike Hookham, who her family, Nitahawas, were from what is a lake that was part of now her Prince Albert National Park, and they were displaced. So those photographs are evidence that these national parks are Indigenous land. And there was an article in the Atlantic magazine in the States about a month ago, about a really great article with some great photographs, just about, it was mostly focused on the States, but it's very much applicable here, about giving the national parks back to whatever tribe is in that region, or whatever community is in that region. And I take that kind of stuff. I know some people would look at that and say that's really pie in the sky, that's never going to happen. I think someday it has to happen, and I really would like to see that happen. So the photographs in those cases become the evidence, the living representation that, yes, there were people here, and those people were forced out, but this was their land. So the photography, I think, can be a very important tool in the whole land back thing and that whole issue. So as you pointed out in the beginning, that's really another important aspect of these archival photos.
Mm-hmm. I love this when you were talking about the gaze, the northern gaze, the southern gaze, the Indigenous, the non-Indigenous gaze. And like you, as a storyteller, I at one point just had to stop reading stories written about us, not by us, and talking more to the elders. And so just talking more about why you reference these different perceptions of our of Indigenous peoples in these images. And I think that does have to do with the archival element and just that perception. So I don't want to spend too much time on Edward Curtis. I feel like Edward Curtis has gotten a ton of play in his whole career, and the images that he's had, and the dispelling of the myth. I think it's a good representation of how to dispel myth rather than create myth.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. And when I was doing the presentation yesterday, it's hard not to mention Edward Curtis or here in Canada, Geraldine Moody, or anyone else who was kind of that settler gaze, and all those tropes that we talked about yesterday. And we don't need to go into a big discussion, the vanishing race and the noble, quote unquote, savage, all those things that are had such an impact that even now, and there's a lot of Indigenous academics, artists, photographers who have researched and done very good analysis of Curtis, etc. And both the positive and both the negative aspects of it. But those images have such a resonance when you travel, when you're in Europe, or when you're almost anywhere in the world, Japan or whatever, when they think of Native American Indian, they get into that trope, and that trope, of beads and feather and buckskin, and they're constantly shocked and surprised that Indigenous peoples are living, vibrant individuals and communities, and we don't all agree. We're all individuals. We don't all share one single common value. We're not all on the powwow trail. We're not all doing this or that. We are, we're complex survivors, and we have vibrant communities and vibrant expressions. So that, what I like about that, and what I like about what's happening with contemporary Indigenous photography, is how it can subvert that settler gaze that came with the invention of the camera, and Edward Curtis, his photography, was just at the tail end of the camera being a tool of manifest destiny and westward expansion. So he's really part of that whole process. And he was financed by JP Morgan. It was just, it was very much a combination of, yes, let's capture the vanishing Indian that we helped destroy, and also let's romanticize it and package it and sell it to outside gaze. So it's that packaging, I think, that we have to see and understand if we're going to understand not just the history of Indigenous imagery and photography, but where it's going today, and where a lot of contemporary Indigenous photographers are taking us. So to me, that's really an exciting part of this whole discussion that we're having in terms of the Indigenous image, and challenging it, and it's not just to challenge it, because that's one aspect of it, but also to just go where we want to go with our imagery, and not even at times to even think about it, and do something that's totally us, and totally me as a photographer, and not trying to, okay, what do people want to see here? What do I want to see? What does my subject want to pose? How do they want to be posed? And what I like about the methodology of a lot of contemporary photographers now, I'm thinking Will Wilson, for instance, then a photographer, and when he did his tintype photographs, which are kind of based on that Edward Curtis thing, what he does is he takes this subject and he lets them, they direct the pose, they direct how it's shot. So that to me is just changing that around. Because it's no longer the photographer kind of in control. And I like what Will Wilson's not the only one doing that. Other photographers are doing that as well. So it's the person in the photo deciding what they're going to wear, whether they're going to wear, how they're going to dress, whether they're going to dress in regalia, whether they're going to dress in contemporary clothes, but how they're going to pose. And also what he does is leaves the original tintype with the subject. So it's theirs. And with their agreement, then the prints of it will go into whatever exhibition it is. So I like that kind of, that respectful process that can take place now with Indigenous photography. And I think we're going to see more of that.
Yeah. It's a reclamation, as you kind of mentioned yesterday. It is really a reclamation. I think of Kelly Spritzer, like using,
yes,
I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding that that we lose our identity by using contemporary practice. And that's really, really not true, that we use contemporary practice to connect to our Indigenous perspective, our Indigenous ways of knowing and being, our value system, our artistic creative idea. Like adaptability is one of the greatest gifts that we've been given as Indigenous peoples. And so that is just a tool to get us to connect to who we are and what our voice is, however we decide to express that voice. And how we get to be seen and perceived is a part of that. So and thinking about your mother when you were sharing yesterday, how she wanted us to see ourselves in a different way, or by Canada, by each other. And my mother's a residential school survivor as well, and she always talks about how important it is to grow from that and understand understand what was lost, but then to really work hard to reclaim what we have still, and what we have within us. And so what was a nice surprise for me in your presentation yesterday was seeing you bringing up those contemporary photographers, those artists that are bringing forward using photography as a part of their way to show their culture. And like Callie's amazing, like that work is amazing.
It is, and I totally appreciate your comments there, Renata. I think it's such an important thing, and it's Callie's work, and also Nadia's work with the Red Share sessions.
Oh yes,
is also another really good example of what you're talking about, and it's going to be really fun to watch out where the contemporary photographers take this. So I think we are seeing incredible work now, and we're going to see more amazing work that just I think is part of that whole because the theme here is decolonizing the narrative, right?
Yeah.
And so in many ways, we're also decolonizing that visual narrative, and that's what the photographers are doing. And it can be provocative, it can be funny, it can be a lot of things, but it's just great to see it happen, happening.
Yeah, not Nadia Kwandabens. And so Nadia, she's she comes from Anishinaabe territory in Ontario, an incredible photographer that takes pictures of like headshots. I always get her to take my headshots, but she also takes pictures of like lawyers and grandmothers. And her Red Chair session was about celebrating artists in their best self, shining a best light on them, and they've it's kind of incredible the acclaim that she's received by celebrating a positive and true representation of Indigenous peoples through her lens, and just a wonderful, humble human. I mean, to be able to, I think, be a photographer, you have to kind of put yourself away a lot to be able to see the world unfold in front of you, and then kind of capture a little bit of that moment. And I think Rosemary really did a great job of doing that in the Arctic. Like that picture you took with the two Inuit girls, like kind of napping on boxes, like you just have to kind of see the world through that way to be able to kind of capture that kind of world.
No, I think that's really true, Renata. Another visual artist or photographer who I think is also doing really interesting work is Wendy Red Star. And she is doing it with humor, and she's diving into stereotypes. She's also diving into her own family history on the Crow Reservation in Montana, and she's using text on top of photos. She has some great photo series of different seasons where she's posing in Crow regalia, but there's a plastic deer beside her and another plastic deer there, and all these animals are this whole trope about we're at one with nature. So she's just taking that over the top. The colors are just vivid doesn't do them justice. They're over the top, I would say. And there's what's obviously a fake mountain scene behind her, with clouds and sun and stuff. So I like her work as well, and I think it's with humor, she's challenging that settler gaze, and also she's dismantling the romanticization of Indigenous peoples that can be very can be a very limiting frame, and to have to kind of navigate, and she's finding ways to steer around it and to play with it. And I really like that kind of work that she's doing as well.
One of the questions I'm just noticing in the chat, there's a good question in here by Jillian Dolan. She's asking, I'd love to hear Paul speak about the role of the artist, historian, or viewer as witnesses and the responsibilities that might be ascribed, especially with the idea that the viewers have a duty to seek images that show joy as often as trauma to prevent the dehumanization of the subject.
That's a really good question, and I think it's a layered question. I'm just working on my mind how first to respond to it, because it's a big issue. On the first level, I think we are so used to being excavated for trauma or tragedy, or being seen as victims, and that's in the media, that's in photojournalism. We see that anytime there's trauma in a community or something, the way it's covered, the way it's photographed, is often done basically, the expression, it's kind of like trauma porn. It's done to get clicks, it's done to get people reading, but it really it can really limit and disrespect not only individuals but whole communities. And I'm not saying that bad things don't happen. We know they do, and we know they have in the past, obviously. But a community or an individual or a family is so much more than that. And we don't reduce a community to just being an awful place because they're having a crisis. There are people in every community who are doing wonderful things, and there are people who are working to make things better. And if the imagery, if the photography, if the journalism is simply focused on the negative, then that's negativity is just going to go out into the world. And that's for people who will never be to that community, for people who don't know anyone from that community, that becomes the community in their eyes. And it's a disrespectful relationship. So I think if we're talking about media or news coverage and how photography has a role to play there, I think there's a responsibility in photojournalism to see beyond that and to reflect a more layered and nuanced framing of both individuals and communities. And that's probably best done by people who know the community. It's probably best done in most cases by photojournalists who have from that community, or have an understanding of that community, or have done their homework. Because without that, then you fall into this other thing that I think the question was addressing, and that it's always that trying to find that balance, so you're not just focused on the bad thing, and to get beyond that. And there's a responsibility when you're framing an image that it's more than just being exploitive. It hopefully contains a positivity, because we're here, and we're talking about Indigenous photography because Indigenous peoples and communities are here. And that may seem obvious to say, but I think it's the starting point. And it's not exactly the vanishing race thing, but the tragic trauma thing is still very exploitative, and is very misrepresentative on many levels of contemporary Indigenous realities. And because it's not what I see every day. It's not the people I collaborate with or talk to or work with. They're not walking around with their head down, feeling sad and looking for pity. You know, it's not the reality. And I'm really more interested in the photography that represents where we're at, and that place is so much more than that the bad things we're talking about.
Yeah, 110% agree with you. And Ella's she's a wonderful Enoch writer. She's based in the States, and she has family here in Canada. She's from Labrador, so she's just saying, "Nakamik Paul for saying that." I'm clapping.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that.
She was one of our participants for our Right Over Here literary arts residency, and
awesome.
Yeah, just been really incredible. And when we think about that, you're like in the contemporary lens and capturing kind of the sadness and the trauma porn that you're mentioning, it's like, we all have good days and bad days, and sometimes it feels like it's easier for society to see us in a sad, needing place rather than seeing us shining in a joyful, resilient place. And I think just recognizing and acknowledging that these images feed a narrative that can make non-Indigenous people just feel more comfortable. And you talk about that savior mentality. You talk about that. Right. That in the past mentality, like it's so much better when we think of Indigenous people in the past, because we don't have to see them now and have to have relations with them in ways that can kind of bring us forward, and why it's so important to capture, a life rather than a moment in that life, and offering reference to that. And that just leads into the humor element, because my grandma would say, like, I really love North of 60, but boy, I wish they would laugh more, because our community has so much humor in it. And when we think about, like, humor is the ultimate form of freedom, it has it just shows us that we understand where we are, but understand that there's a greater life within that sadness and pain. And so I like that you keep touching into the element of humor in the photography, humor in the community, and how important that is.
I think it's very important, Renata, and I think we're seeing more of that with across the arts now, particularly with, if you look at television shows like Reservation Dogs, and Rutherford Falls, and I haven't seen Reservation Dogs yet because of this colonial border that somehow is affecting what I get to watch, but I will see it at some point. And but that's exactly it. It's, I think the aspect of humor, and it's not, I don't think it's just the humor, it's trying to reflect our own diversity, and I think that's also an important aspect. I understand, and it makes sense, back when we go back to the 80s or not, go back 30, 40 years, and you have Dances with Wolves and things like that, and Last of the Mohicans. There's you get a certain, the humor is there a little bit, but this kind of pan-Indian thing, that happens, which can reduce everyone, and it's usually reducing everyone to kind of being and I'm from this background, so I can say kind of being a Plains tribe kind of thing which is this obsession that the settler gaze seems to focus on a lot. So like shows like Reservation Dogs, which is set in Oklahoma, and other shows that are trying to show that this is a community these are people in this part of in this region, in this area, and this is their life, this is their humor, this is how they are. So it's not just trying to be this generic reservation that could be anywhere in North America kind of thing, which is, I think when you talk about the thing with, there's north of 60, and there's probably a few other examples, which I can think back to, and I don't want to start being critical of them, so I'm not going to name them.
Oh, no, they were great. They were great. They just weren't super funny.
No, that's the thing. There's sometimes they fell into this really dark place, and people always seem so serious. When you travel anywhere, there's there's laughter, and there's teasing, and there's all this other stuff that takes place in different ways in different communities. And it's when you get that kind of rapport that I think it's more truthful to a lived experience than just dealing with a kind of somber dark side. And also, I think this is true in photography too. I think there's in Indigenous photography now, I think we're seeing much more awareness of the importance of where you come from, and reflecting not just a pan kind of lens, but a really focused lens that is reflective of that community, of that family, of that person, because within our own realities, we have such a diversity. And I'm really, I think it's something that is important with photography. It's important with not just the naming of people who are in these photographs. It's important also in locating them within the community. It's important with locating them within the family. So that it's that kind of layered research and layered storytelling that is so important, and gets away from that kind of traveling suitcase of props, of feather and beads and whatever else that, you're Indigenous, this is what you should be wearing. It is deconstructing that.
Absolutely. I mean, that actually dives into really what this is about. Is this couldn't have been done if it wasn't you doing it through your whole life, just by being you, by being Paul, like by being Indigenous, by having the life experience that you have, to have experience within the country that you have, and being a storyteller in your own right. Like, when we think about example, North of 60 is just an example, but who was programming at that time? It wasn't Indigenous people that were editing and vetting and producing. It was done through a non-Indigenous lens. And so you can only go so far. And you can guarantee that those actors were laughing backstage the entire time. You can
for sure. Yeah.
that the writers were writing really funny things that just didn't get captured because the lens wasn't in that full Indigenous. What we're seeing with like Reservation Dogs, and even with like Rutherford Heights, is that we're really seeing that our narrative is getting to those places that allows us to actually bring some of the backstage on stage. And the work that no one else could have done what you've done because of the lens that you bring and the history that you bring. And that really needs to be acknowledged and recognized, that there's such a sensitivity to the work that you do as an artist that you brought really forward in these images and how you treat them. Like, I follow your social media, but you could tell when you've received family archives, because you recognize the family, and you put in there, looking for names or these, so that we can, and then you tell us these images are going back to the community. Like, there's such a transparent communication that on social media can really feel like it's black or white, or could get that kind of sensitive narrative could get lost. And so just acknowledging that, this isn't, this is work that only could really be done by someone like by you. I don't know anyone else who could do this.
Oh. I'm sure there's someone out there, but I thank you for that, Renato. Those are very kind words. I am really, I think I feel in a good place to be part of with this project and how it's placed, and also to get to follow and watch the work that other Indigenous artists are doing. That's really important, and in my case, particularly Indigenous photographers. And you're absolutely right. There was laughter behind the scenes at North of 60 for sure, because we both know some of the actors in that series, and they are funny people. So it's certainly that was there, and we've come so far. It was 69 that the Indian film crew formed at the National Film Board. Before that, there was no one. There was the odd Indigenous run documentary, but the Indian film crew came together to take autonomy and to say, hey, we're going to control this now. We're going to do this. And steps like that, laid the groundwork for where we are today and where we're going. So I really want to acknowledge those people back in the 60s who are doing that kind of work and who really laid the groundwork for the work that not just I'm doing, but all filmmakers and photographers and anyone dealing with images and visual arts. I think and film and media, we really owe a debt to that generation, and because they really kind of ran into that brick wall, and they didn't let it stop it. They put the res car in reverse, floored it, and just blew that wall apart. And that's how we can create what we're creating today. So I really want to acknowledge them.
Absolutely. Hands up. So we have a few moments left, and I think what I'm thinking about is where does this go? You've now become this portal of knowledge and history sharing and celebrating. You've built a lot of trust with a lot of different communities. And how do you see this going?
Good question. Where do I see it going? I know I do seriously. I think in the past 8 years, I made some errors. I did not take into account the ephemeral nature of the internet, of social media. So what was that photo I did on Facebook 6 years ago that all these people responded to? Where is it? And have to try and search back to find it. And so the one thing I've learned is I've started the process of just actually having my own database. So I know where it is. I know where these things are, so that for research purposes, I can find them. The next step in that will be to establish a portal, if you will, or a website, which will be a tool for students, for family members, for researchers, where they can key in a family name, they can key in a community, they can key in a time period, and it's going to lead them places. It's not going to be on the website. The website is going to be like a central link that'll take them to all the possible places they can go and find what they're searching for. Because as far as I know, there's been nothing that's kind of centralized a research hub to go out and find all these images. And that's where I want to go next with this. And it'll mean working, finding the funding, finding someone who has technical skills to create such a beast, because I certainly don't. But that's the next step, is because otherwise, the way the internet and the World Wide Web is this stuff will be gone tomorrow. Yeah. It's here today, gone tomorrow, and it's to ensure that it's there for future generations. So that in a nutshell is the next step forward.
Amazing. Did
I
you
hope
ever think
so.
that this was going to be you? Like you're like, once you started finding it, you're like, oh, I never thought that this was going to be.
I try not to do that because, I'm a human like everyone, and I have moments of imposter syndrome. And do I really know what the F am I doing? And so, yeah, I try not to go there too often, because if I do that, I'm just going to curl up in the corner and not do anything. So
Yeah.
I just try to let the work pull me along with it. And so
Amazing.
far it's working.
Yeah, it's incredible. Wow, 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 wow. So I think there's just like a couple things. We'll send you the chat because there's people making some references going, does Paul know about this? And does Paul know about that? So we'll pull that out for you and send
Okay,
that your
awesome,
way.
awesome,
Yeah, yeah.
awesome.
Oh, wow. So thank you so much, Masi Kuyanik, for joining us over these past couple of days. And I really do look forward to seeing you in person. And please come visit, or hopefully we cross paths sooner than later. Would be really nice.
I really look forward to that, Renata. And hi. Thank you to you and for everyone who's joined us. It's been wonderful, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, incredible. So thank you. So, and everyone, so again, this was a wonderful support by RBC and Slate Foundation and Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. And if you, we are continuing these sessions. The next one will be Santee Smith, third week of the month next month. Also be talking to Christy Belcourt and to Tasha Hubbard. And so please keep joining in.
Those sound exciting. Thank you,
I
Renata.
know.
You have a fun job.
I can't complain about this when I just get to listen to incredible people.